The morning sun cast long shadows across the palace courtyard as Camilla stood at her bedroom window, watching the guards change shifts below. She had grown accustomed to this routine over the past 3 years, finding comfort in the predictable rhythm of palace life. The ornate clock on her mantelpiece chimed 8 times, signaling another day in what she believed would be her forever home. Camilla had never imagined her life would take such a dramatic turn when she first married into the royal family. Born into a modest middle-class family in the countryside, she had worked as a librarian in a small town before meeting Prince Edward at a charity fundraiser. Their whirlwind romance had captivated the nation, with newspapers calling it a modern fairy tale. The wedding had been spectacular, with thousands lining the streets to catch a glimpse of the commoner who had won the prince's heart. Now, 3 years later, Camilla felt more settled in her role as a duchess. She had learned the complex protocols, mastered the art of royal conversation, and genuinely enjoyed her charitable work with literacy programs across the kingdom. Her 2 children from her previous marriage, Emma and James, had also adapted well to palace life. Emma, now 16, attended an exclusive boarding school but spent her holidays at the palace, while 12-year-old James lived with them full-time and was tutored by the finest educators money could hire. The palace staff had grown fond of Camilla's warm, approachable nature. Unlike some royals who maintained strict distance from servants, Camilla remembered everyone's names and often asked about their families. Mrs. Henderson, the head housekeeper, frequently commented that the Duchess brought a breath of fresh air to the old stone walls that had seen centuries of formality and tradition. On this particular morning, Camilla was preparing for a busy day ahead. She had a meeting with the board of the National Literacy Foundation, followed by a visit to a new children's library in the city center. These engagements filled her with genuine excitement. Working with books and education had always been her passion, and being able to use her position to promote reading among disadvantaged children felt like a perfect marriage of her old life and new responsibilities. As she selected her outfit for the day, a soft blue dress that photographed well but remained modest and appropriate, Camilla reflected on how much her life had changed. The girl who once spent quiet evenings reading in her small cottage now lived in rooms that could house entire families. She missed the simplicity sometimes, but she had found ways to create intimate spaces within the grandeur. Her private sitting room was filled with personal photographs, favorite books, and comfortable furniture that reminded her of home. Prince Edward had left early that morning for a series of military inspections that would keep him away for 2 days. Before departing, he had kissed her goodbye and reminded her about the dinner party they were hosting the following week for several foreign dignitaries. These events still made Camilla nervous, but she had learned to navigate them with grace, often preparing conversation topics in advance and relying on her genuine interest in other people to carry her through. The breakfast room buzzed with quiet activity as Camilla joined James for their morning meal. He was an energetic boy with an insatiable curiosity about everything around him. Living in the palace had opened up incredible opportunities for his education, with access to tutors who were experts in their fields and educational trips to museums and historical sites that money couldn't typically buy. James particularly loved the palace library, a vast room filled with rare manuscripts and first editions that fascinated his young mind. "Mother, did you know that some of the books in the library are over 500 years old?" James asked between bites of his breakfast. His enthusiasm for learning always brightened Camilla's day. "I didn't know that, darling. Perhaps we can ask the librarian to show you some of the illuminated manuscripts this afternoon," Camilla replied, spreading marmalade on her toast. These quiet moments with her son were precious to her, providing a sense of normalcy in their extraordinary circumstances. As they chatted about his studies and her upcoming engagements, Camilla noticed an unusual amount of activity in the courtyard below. More guards than usual seemed to be moving about, and there were several official-looking cars parked near the main entrance. She made a mental note to ask about it later, but didn't think too much of it at the time. The palace often had unexpected visitors and security changes. After breakfast, Camilla made her way to her private office to review her schedule with her personal assistant, Sarah. Sarah had been with her since the beginning of her marriage and had become more than just an employee. She was a trusted friend and confidant. Together, they had navigated the complexities of royal protocol and public expectations. "Your Grace, there's been a small change to this morning's schedule," Sarah said, her voice carrying an unusual note of tension. "The meeting with the Literacy Foundation has been postponed until tomorrow." Camilla looked up from her papers, sensing something in Sarah's tone. Is everything all right? That's quite last minute for them to reschedule. Sarah hesitated for a moment, glancing toward the door as if ensuring they wouldn't be overheard. I'm not entirely certain, Your Grace. The message came through official palace channels rather than directly from the Foundation. Perhaps there's some sort of security concern or protocol issue. Before Camilla could respond, there was a firm knock at the office door. This was unusual, as most staff members would typically wait to be summoned or would have Sarah announce visitors. The door opened to reveal Colonel Harrison, the head of palace security, accompanied by two other officials Camilla didn't recognize. Your Grace, Colonel Harrison said with a formal bow, his usual warm demeanor noticeably absent. I'm afraid I need to speak with you urgently about a matter of considerable importance. Camilla felt a flutter of anxiety in her stomach. The colonel's serious expression and the presence of the unknown officials suggested this was no routine security briefing. She gestured for them to sit, but Colonel Harrison remained standing, which only heightened her growing concern. I'm afraid I have some rather difficult news to share with you. The colonel began, his voice carefully measured. There have been some developments regarding your family's status within the royal household that require immediate attention. The words hit Camilla like a physical blow. Family status? What could that possibly mean? She had done nothing wrong, had fulfilled every duty asked of her, and had genuinely tried to serve the crown with dignity and dedication. Her mind raced through recent events, searching for any clue about what might have prompted this ominous visit. I don't understand, Camilla said, her voice barely above a whisper. What developments? Has something happened to Edward? Colonel Harrison exchanged glances with his companions before continuing. Prince Edward is well, Your Grace. This matter concerns decisions that have been made at the highest levels of the royal family regarding the future direction of the monarchy. I'm afraid I'm not at liberty to discuss the specific details, but I've been instructed to inform you that arrangements are being made for your departure from the palace. The room seemed to spin around Camilla as she processed these words. Departure? After 3 years of building a life here, of her children settling into their education and social circles, of finding her place in this ancient institution, the very idea seemed impossible, like waking up from a vivid dream to find reality completely altered. This must be some sort of mistake, Camilla said, standing up abruptly. I need to speak with Edward immediately. When will he be returning? I'm afraid that won't be possible at this time, Your Grace. Prince Edward has been informed of these decisions and is currently fulfilling his duties as instructed by His Majesty. The arrangements for your departure are to be completed within the next 48 hours. 48 hours. The words echoed in Camilla's mind as she struggled to comprehend the magnitude of what she was being told. Everything she had built, every relationship she had formed, every plan she had made for the future was being swept away with clinical efficiency. The fairy tale was ending, but not with the happily ever after she had expected. Sarah reached out instinctively to steady Camilla, her own face pale with shock. The personal assistant had become deeply invested in Camilla's success and happiness, and this sudden reversal was as devastating to her as it was to her employer. What about James? Camilla asked, her maternal instincts overriding her personal shock. What about Emma? They've built their lives here. James has his tutors, his friends among the staff. Emma is in the middle of her academic year. Surely the children's welfare must be considered in whatever decisions have been made. Colonel Harrison's expression softened slightly at the mention of the children, revealing a glimpse of the man she had known for 3 years rather than the bearer of official bad news he had been forced to become. Arrangements will be made for the children's education to continue without interruption, though the specific details are still being finalized. I understand this is tremendously difficult news, Your Grace. Camilla sank back into her chair, her legs suddenly, feeling unable to support her. The reality of the situation was beginning to penetrate the initial shock. This wasn't a temporary setback or a misunderstanding that could be resolved through conversation and clarification. This was a fundamental change in her life's direction, imposed from above without her input or consent. May I ask what I've done wrong? She whispered, her voice breaking slightly. I've tried so hard to fulfill every expectation, to represent the family with dignity, to contribute meaningfully to the causes I've been asked to support. If I failed in some way, surely I deserve to know how. The colonel's discomfort was evident as he struggled with how much to reveal. Your Grace, this is not about any failure on your part. These decisions sometimes involve considerations beyond individual performance or conduct. The monarchy must sometimes make choices based on broader strategic or political factors. Strategic factors. Political considerations. The words felt cold and impersonal, reducing 3 years of her life and her children's stability to mere calculations in some larger game she hadn't even known she was playing. Camilla had always understood that royal life involved public scrutiny and formal protocols, but she had believed that genuine effort and good intentions would be enough to secure her family's place. As the officials continued to outline the logistics of their departure, Camilla's mind wandered to all the people who would be affected by this decision. The staff members who had become like family to her, the charitable organizations that depended on her patronage, the children in the literacy programs who looked forward to her visits. How could she explain to them that she was simply disappearing from their lives without warning? The irony wasn't lost on her that she had spent the morning planning to visit a new children's library, excited about inspiring young people to lose themselves in stories of adventure and possibility. Now she found herself the protagonist in a story she never wanted to be part of, facing an uncertain chapter with no clear resolution in sight. Colonel Harrison was explaining something about packing procedures and security protocols, but Camilla found it difficult to focus on the practical details. The emotional weight of the situation was overwhelming, like trying to process the end of a marriage, the loss of a career, and the destruction of her children's stability all at once. "How long have you known about this?" she asked suddenly, interrupting the colonel's explanation about which personal items could be taken immediately versus what would need to be shipped later. The question seemed to catch him off guard. "The final decision was communicated to security this morning, Your Grace. We've been preparing the necessary arrangements since then." This morning, while she had been having breakfast with James, discussing ancient manuscripts and planning their afternoon together, her entire future was being decided and implemented by people she might never even meet. The speed and efficiency of it all suggested this wasn't a spontaneous decision, but rather the culmination of discussions and planning that had been happening without her knowledge. As the meeting concluded and the officials departed, Camilla found herself alone with Sarah in the suddenly oppressive silence of her office. The familiar surroundings that had represented security and belonging now felt like stage props in a play that was ending. Everything looked the same, but everything had fundamentally changed. "What do we do now?" Sarah asked quietly, her own future suddenly uncertain as well. Camilla looked out the window at the gardens where she had spent countless hours walking and thinking, where James had played and Emma had wandered during school holidays. Soon, other people would occupy these rooms, sit in these chairs, and look out these windows at the same view. Life in the palace would continue, but without them. "Now we figure out how to tell the children," Camilla said finally, her voice steadier than she felt. "And then we prepare to go home, wherever that might be." The word home felt strange in her mouth. The palace had been home for 3 years, but before that, home had been a small cottage in the countryside, a place that now belonged to someone else. They would have to create a new definition of home, build a new life from the pieces of their old one. The thought was both terrifying and, in a small way, liberating. As Sarah began making preliminary lists of what needed to be done, Camilla remained at the window, watching the guards continue their eternal patrol of the grounds. Tomorrow, she would no longer have the right to stand at this window. Tomorrow, she would be someone else entirely, her identity as a member of the royal family stripped away as efficiently as it had been bestowed. The fairy tale was ending, but, perhaps, she thought with growing determination, the real story was just beginning. The afternoon sun slanted through the tall windows of Camilla's sitting room as she waited for James to return from his mathematics lesson. She had spent the past 3 hours in a state of suspended animation, unable to focus on anything except the conversation she dreaded having with her son. How do you explain to a 12-year-old boy that his entire world is about to disappear? How do you tell a child who has never known insecurity that everything familiar is being taken away? Sarah had discreetly begun making phone calls from the adjacent office, her voice a low murmur as she tried to understand the logistics of their departure. Camilla could hear fragments of conversations about storage facilities, school transfers, and temporary housing. Each overheard phrase felt like another nail in the coffin of the life they had built together. When James finally burst through the door with his usual enthusiasm, chattering about the geometry problem he had solved and the upcoming science experiment his tutor had planned, Camilla felt her heart break a little more. His innocence and excitement stood in sharp contrast to the devastating news she was about to deliver. "Mother, you should have seen the equation I worked out today. Mr. Peterson says I'm ready to move on to more advanced concepts next week," James said, settling into his favorite armchair with a book about astronomy. And he mentioned that there might be a special telescope viewing session next month with the Royal Observatory. Can we arrange that? Camilla watched her son's animated face and felt the full weight of what was being taken from him. Not just the telescope viewing or the advanced mathematics lessons, but the sense of limitless possibility that came with being part of the royal family. The doors that had opened for him would close just as suddenly as they had appeared. James, darling, I need to talk to you about something very important, Camilla began, moving to sit closer to him. Something that's going to change things for our family. The seriousness in her tone immediately caught his attention. James had inherited his mother's intuitive nature and could sense when something significant was happening. His excited chatter stopped, and he looked at her with the kind of focused attention that reminded her how mature he had become during their years at the palace. Is it about Emma? Is she all right at school? He asked, his first concern naturally going to his sister. Emma is fine, sweetheart. This is about us, about our living situation here at the palace. Camilla paused, searching for words that would be honest, but not more frightening than necessary. We're going to need to leave the palace soon and find a new place to live. James stared at her for a long moment, processing this information. Leave? But why? This is our home. Are we going on a long holiday? No, darling. This is permanent. There have been some decisions made by the royal family that mean we can't continue living here. Camilla reached for his hand, noticing how small it still seemed despite his growing independence. I know this is difficult to understand. It's difficult for me to understand too. The confusion in James's eyes was heartbreaking. In his 3 years at the palace, he had never questioned their right to be there. He had absorbed the protocols and expectations as naturally as any child adapts to their environment. The idea that this secure foundation could simply be removed had never occurred to him. But what about my lessons with Mr. Peterson? And the library project I'm working on with the head librarian? We were going to catalog some of the medieval manuscripts. His voice was becoming smaller, the reality of what leaving meant beginning to dawn on him. What about Emma's school? She loves it there. Camilla pulled him closer, feeling his body tense with anxiety. We'll find ways to continue your education, James. You're brilliant, and that doesn't change just because we're leaving the palace. As for Emma, we'll need to discuss her options with her when she comes home for the weekend. Where will we live? The question was barely whispered, and Camilla realized that her son had no frame of reference for life outside the palace. His memories of their previous home were vague and overlaid with 3 years of royal comfort and security. I don't know yet, but we'll find somewhere good. Somewhere we can be happy together. Even as she said the words, Camilla wasn't sure she believed them. How could they possibly recreate the life they had built here? How could she provide James and Emma with the same opportunities they had come to expect? The sound of footsteps in the hallway interrupted their conversation. Sarah appeared in the doorway, her expression carefully neutral, but her eyes revealing the stress of the afternoon's revelations. Your Grace, I've been in contact with several possibilities for temporary accommodation. There's a furnished cottage available in the Cotswolds that might serve as a transition space while we determine longer-term arrangements. Sarah's voice was professional, but Camilla could hear the underlying sadness. This had been Sarah's life too, her identity as much tied to the palace as anyone's. A cottage in the Cotswolds. It sounded quaint and peaceful, but it also sounded like exile. From the center of national life to a rural retreat where nobody would remember or care that they had once been part of the royal family. The transition would be jarring for all of them, but especially for the children who had known nothing but privilege and possibility. When do we have to leave? James asked, his practical nature asserting itself even in the midst of emotional turmoil. Tomorrow evening, Camilla replied, the words tasting bitter in her mouth. We need to pack our most important belongings tonight and tomorrow morning. Tomorrow. James's voice cracked slightly. But I haven't said goodbye to anyone. What about Mrs. Henderson? And the garden staff who taught me about the roses? What about my books in the library? The questions kept coming, each one representing another thread being severed from the tapestry of their life at the palace. Camilla realized that saying goodbye properly would be almost as difficult as leaving itself. How could they compress 3 years of relationships and experiences into a few hurried farewell conversations? As the afternoon wore on, word of their departure began to spread through the palace staff networks with the efficiency of any close-knit community. Mrs. Henderson was the first to arrive at their door, her eyes red-rimmed and her usual composure shaken. Your Grace, I can't believe what I'm hearing. Surely there's been some mistake, she said, wrapping Camilla in an impromptu hug that would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances. The genuine affection and distress from the staff was both comforting and heartbreaking. These people had become family to Camilla and the children, providing stability and warmth that went far beyond their professional duties. Losing these relationships felt like losing extended family members with no possibility of regular contact. "I'm afraid it's true, Mrs. Henderson. We'll be leaving tomorrow evening." Camilla found herself comforting the woman who had taken such good care of their household. "You've been wonderful to us. I hope you know how much your kindness has meant to our family." Throughout the evening, a steady stream of staff members found reasons to visit their quarters. The head gardener brought James a small potted plant from the rose garden, explaining that it was a cutting from his favorite bush and would bloom wherever he planted it. The palace librarian arrived with a carefully selected collection of books, explaining that they were duplicates the library wouldn't miss, and that James should have them for his continued studies. Each gesture of kindness made the leaving more difficult, but also reinforced how much love they had found within the formal walls of the palace. These weren't just employees performing duties. They were people who genuinely cared about Camilla and her children's welfare. As night fell, Camilla began the painful process of deciding what to pack. 3 years of accumulated belongings had to be reduced to what they could realistically take with them immediately. The formal gowns and tiaras that had once made her feel like a fairy tale princess now seemed like costumes from someone else's life. The photographs and personal mementos held more value than any of the expensive jewelry or designer clothing. James sat on his bedroom floor, surrounded by books, toys, and keepsakes, trying to make impossible choices about what mattered most. His collection of model airplanes, assembled with help from various staff members during quiet afternoon hours, represented not just toys but relationships and shared experiences that couldn't be packed into boxes. "Mother, can we take the painting Emma made for my birthday last year?" he asked, holding up a watercolor of the palace gardens that his sister had created during art class. "I know it's not very good, but it reminds me of her." "Of course, darling. We'll make sure to take all the special things that connect us to each other and to the happy times we've had here." Camilla knelt beside him, helping to wrap the painting carefully. "And remember, Emma will be with us again very soon." This is hard for her too. They had managed to reach Emma at school that afternoon, and the conversation had been devastating. At 16, Emma understood the implications of their departure more clearly than James, and her angry questions about the unfairness of the situation had been difficult to answer. Why should they have to leave when they had done nothing wrong? Why couldn't she finish her final years at the school she loved? Why was their family being torn apart by decisions they had no control over? Camilla had no good answers for her daughter's questions because she was struggling with the same feelings of anger and helplessness. The arbitrary nature of their dismissal felt particularly cruel, given how hard they had all worked to earn their place within the royal family structure. As midnight approached, the palace grew quiet around them. The guards continued their patrols, the staff completed their evening routines, and the ancient building settled into its nighttime rhythm. For Camilla, lying awake in the bed she would sleep in for the last time, every sound seemed magnified and significant. She thought about Edward, somewhere across the country, carrying out his military duties while his family faced this crisis alone. His absence during this crucial time felt like another betrayal, another sign that the relationships she had believed were solid and lasting were actually far more fragile than she had understood. The next morning dawned gray and drizzly, as if the weather was reflecting the mood within the palace walls. Camilla woke early, having slept little, and found herself wandering through the rooms that had been her private sanctuary. Each corner held memories of quiet conversations with the children, peaceful hours reading or working on correspondence, and moments of genuine happiness in her role as a royal family member. Sarah arrived with coffee and a detailed timeline for the day's activities. There were final arrangements to be made, official papers to be signed, and a carefully choreographed departure to be managed that would minimize public attention and maintain the dignity of all parties involved. "The cars will arrive at 4 o'clock, Sarah explained, consulting her notes. "Your personal items will be loaded first, then Master James's belongings. The remainder of your possessions will be inventoried and shipped to the Cotswolds cottage within the week." The clinical efficiency of it all was somehow worse than the emotional chaos. Camilla would have preferred tears and drama to this careful dismantling of their life conducted with such professional detachment. It reduced their family's displacement to a logistical exercise, as if they were merely furniture being relocated rather than people whose hearts were being broken. James spent the morning saying goodbye to his favorite places around the palace. He visited the kitchen where the cook had always saved him special treats, the stables where he had learned to ride, and the library where he had discovered his love of learning. Each farewell was a small tragedy, watched over by staff members who were struggling with their own sense of loss. The arrival of the removal vehicles in the early afternoon marked the point of no return. Boxes and suitcases that represented 3 years of accumulated life were loaded with mechanical precision, while Camilla and James watched from an upstairs window. It was like watching their identity being erased in real time. Colonel Harrison appeared for a final briefing about security arrangements and the transition process. His professionalism couldn't entirely mask his personal regret about the situation, and Camilla found herself oddly grateful for his obvious discomfort. At least someone in an official capacity seemed to recognize the human cost of these institutional decisions. Your Grace, I want you to know that this has been one of the most difficult assignments of my career, he said quietly as they reviewed the final arrangements. Your family has been nothing but gracious and cooperative during what I know must be an incredibly painful process. His words provided small comfort, but they also confirmed what Camilla had suspected all along. This wasn't about their behavior or their worthiness to be part of the royal family. They were casualties of larger political or strategic considerations that had nothing to do with them personally. In some ways, that made it even more difficult to accept. As 4 o'clock approached, the moment Camilla had been dreading arrived. It was time to leave the palace forever, to walk away from the life that had defined them for 3 years, and step into an uncertain future. Standing in the entrance hall where she had first arrived as a nervous new bride, she felt the weight of how much had changed and how much they were about to lose. The guards stood at attention as they always did, their faces carefully neutral, but their eyes reflecting the sadness that permeated the entire palace community. These men had protected her family for 3 years, had become familiar faces in their daily routine, and now they were witnessing the end of that chapter with professional stoicism that couldn't entirely hide their human sympathy. James stood beside her, clutching his astronomy book and the small potted rose plant, his young face showing a maturity that broke her heart. He had handled the day with remarkable grace, but she could see the confusion and hurt in his eyes. This would be a defining moment in his childhood, the day his secure world crumbled without warning or explanation. As they walked toward the waiting cars, Camilla felt the full weight of their loss settling over her like a heavy cloak. But somewhere beneath the grief and uncertainty, a small flame of determination flickered to life. They would survive this. They would rebuild. And perhaps, in time, they would discover that their worth and happiness had never really depended on titles or palaces after all. The moment Camilla had been dreading finally arrived as the black sedan pulled up to the palace's main entrance. The sight of the vehicle that would carry them away from their home forever made her legs feel weak. She gripped James's hand tighter, drawing strength from his presence even as her heart shattered at the thought of what this moment meant for his young life. Colonel Harrison stood formally beside the car, his usual warmth replaced by the rigid posture of official duty. Behind him, palace staff had gathered despite the directive that the departure should be discreet. Mrs. Henderson clutched a handkerchief, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. The head gardener stood with his hat in his hands, his face etched with sorrow. Even some of the younger maids had risked disciplinary action to witness their farewell. Your Grace, the colonel said softly, the car is ready. Camilla looked up at the imposing facade of the palace one last time, her eyes tracing the windows of the rooms that had been their sanctuary. Somewhere behind those stone walls were the remnants of the life they were leaving behind. The morning room where she had enjoyed countless breakfasts with the children, the library where James had discovered his love of ancient history, the garden paths where she had walked and planned for a future that would never come to pass. As they approached the vehicle, Mrs. Henderson broke ranks and rushed forward despite protocol. Oh, Your Grace, she whispered, embracing Camilla with the fierce affection of a mother figure. This isn't right. This just isn't right. The older woman's distress triggered something deep in Camilla's chest. Until that moment, she had managed to maintain her composure through sheer force of will, determined to show strength for James and dignity before the watching staff. But Mrs. Henderson's raw emotion, the genuine love and loss in her voice, shattered Camilla's carefully constructed facade. I know, Camilla whispered back, her voice breaking as tears began to fall. I know it isn't right, but we have to be strong. James watched this exchange with wide eyes, his own composure beginning to crack as he witnessed his mother's pain. The boy who had faced the news of their departure with remarkable maturity suddenly looked very young and very scared as the reality of leaving hit him fully. More staff members began to gather, their presence a living testament to the relationships that had developed beyond the formal boundaries of royal protocol. The palace cook appeared with a small wrapped package for James, explaining through her own tears that it contained his favorite biscuits for the journey. The head librarian pressed a leather-bound notebook into Camilla's hands, telling her it was for recording the memories they would make in their new life. Each gesture of love and support made the departure more agonizing. These weren't just employees saying goodbye to their employers. These were people who had become family, witnessing the forced dissolution of bonds that had grown strong over 3 years of shared daily life. Colonel Harrison, clearly uncomfortable with the emotional scene unfolding before him, gently cleared his throat. "Your Grace, I'm afraid we need to maintain our schedule." Camilla nodded, understanding that prolonging the moment would only make it harder for everyone involved. She took a deep breath, straightened her shoulders, and prepared to take the final steps away from the life she had built with such care and hope. But, as she turned toward the car, the sight of all the faces watching her with such genuine sorrow and affection overwhelmed her completely. The weight of all she was losing, not just the status and security, but the community and purpose that had given her life meaning, crashed over her like a wave. Her carefully maintained composure crumbled entirely. The tears she had been holding back for hours began to flow freely as the full magnitude of their loss hit her. This wasn't just about leaving a beautiful building or giving up a title. It was about the destruction of everything they had built together, the severing of relationships that had become precious to her heart. "I can't," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I can't just leave like this." James, seeing his mother's breakdown, began to cry as well. The boy who had been trying so hard to be brave for her sake finally allowed himself to feel the full weight of what was happening to their family. His sobs were heartbreaking, the sound of a child whose secure world was dissolving before his eyes. Sarah stepped forward, her own professionalism finally giving way to the human connection she had developed with this family. "Your Grace, perhaps a moment to collect yourselves?" But Colonel Harrison, bound by orders from above and conscious of the protocol that governed every aspect of palace life, shook his head firmly. "I'm sorry, but we must proceed. These arrangements have been carefully planned, and any delay could complicate matters significantly." The coldness of his response, though she knew it wasn't personal, felt like another blow. Even in this moment of profound loss, the machinery of royal protocol ground on relentlessly, treating their human pain as secondary to administrative convenience. Camilla looked around at the assembled staff, these people who had cared for her family with such dedication and warmth. How could she explain to them that their love and support, while precious beyond measure, couldn't change the fundamental reality of their situation? How could she make them understand that leaving wasn't a choice, but a mandate that brooked no argument or delay? "Please understand," she said, addressing the gathered group through her tears. "This isn't what any of us wanted. You've all been so wonderful to us, so much more than we ever deserved. I hope you know how grateful we are for everything you've done." The inadequacy of words to express the depth of her gratitude and sorrow was painful. 3 years of shared experiences, of daily kindnesses large and small, of genuine affection that had grown beyond the boundaries of duty. None of it could be properly acknowledged or honored in these final moments. Mrs. Henderson reached out to touch Camilla's arm one last time. "We won't forget you, Your Grace. Any of you. What you brought to this place, the kindness you showed to all of us, that won't be forgotten." The promise was both comforting and heartbreaking. To be remembered fondly while being forced to disappear felt like a cruel irony. Camilla had wanted to leave a lasting positive impact on the institution she had served, but not as a cautionary tale or a memory of what might have been. As the guard stepped forward to open the car door, the finality of the moment settled over everyone present. There would be no last-minute reprieve, no sudden change of heart from the decision-makers who had orchestrated this departure. The fairy tale that had begun with such hope and promise was ending with tears and heartbreak in the shadow of the very palace where it had started. James clung to his mother's hand as they approached the vehicle, his small face streaked with tears but his chin set with a determination that reminded Camilla of her own resolve to face whatever came next with dignity. Even in his pain, he was trying to be strong for her, a realization that made her love him even more fiercely. The leather seats of the car felt foreign after years of moving through the palace in their own familiar spaces. As the driver started the engine, Camilla pressed her hand against the window, watching the staff who had gathered to see them off. Each face represented a connection that was being severed, a relationship that had enriched their lives and was now becoming just a memory. Sarah appeared at the car window one last time, pressing her palm against the glass from the outside. Her loyalty had extended far beyond professional obligation, and seeing her standing there as they drove away felt like losing a sister. The personal assistant who had become a friend, the employee who had become family. All of it was being left behind in service to decisions made by people who would never understand the human cost of their choices. As the car began to move, pulling away from the palace entrance and toward the gates that would take them into their uncertain future, Camilla allowed herself one last look back. The massive stone edifice that had been their home stood unchanged, its windows reflecting the late afternoon sun with the same serene beauty that had greeted her every morning for 3 years. But now those windows looked cold and unwelcoming, the palace already beginning to feel like a place that belonged to someone else's story. In a matter of hours, other people would occupy their rooms, sit at their dining table, and walk through gardens where James had played and Emma had dreamed. Life would continue in the palace as if they had never been there at all. The realization that their 3 years of residence would leave no permanent mark on the institution they had served with such dedication was perhaps the most painful aspect of their departure. Royal history would note their time there as a brief interlude, if it was noted at all. The relationships they had cherished, the small improvements they had made to daily life in the palace, the love they had brought to their roles, all of it would fade into institutional memory as if it had never existed. James's hand found hers in the gathering dusk as the car carried them through the palace gates for the final time. "Where are we going, Mother?" he asked quietly, his voice still shaky from crying. "To the Cotswolds, darling. To a cottage where we can rest and think about what comes next," Camilla replied, squeezing his hand reassuringly. "It won't be the same as the palace, but we'll be together. That's what matters most." Even as she said the words, Camilla wondered if she truly believed them. Could they really build a satisfying life after losing so much? Could they find happiness in simplicity after experiencing the resources and opportunities that came with royal status? Most importantly, could she provide her children with the kind of future she had hoped to give them when they had first entered palace life? The countryside began to blur past the car windows as they left London behind, each mile taking them further from the world they had known and deeper into uncertainty. The cottage in the Cotswolds might provide temporary shelter, but it couldn't replace the sense of purpose and belonging that had made their palace life meaningful. As darkness fell and the lights of small villages began to twinkle in the distance, Camilla found herself thinking not about what they had lost, but about what they might discover in the days ahead. The breakdown at the palace had been necessary, a release of emotions that had been building throughout the day. Now, as they traveled toward their new temporary home, she felt a different kind of resolve building within her. They would grieve for what they had lost, but they would not let that grief define their future. Somehow, they would find a way to rebuild not just their living situation, but their sense of identity and purpose. The love that had sustained them through 3 years of royal life would have to be enough to carry them through whatever challenges lay ahead. The road stretched out before them in the car's headlights, leading toward a future that was completely unknown but entirely their own to shape. For the first time in years, they would have the freedom to make choices based purely on what they wanted rather than what was expected of them. It was a frightening prospect, but also, in its own way, liberating. James had fallen asleep against her shoulder, exhausted by the emotional intensity of the day. Looking down at his peaceful face, Camilla made a silent promise to herself and to him. Whatever came next, she would make sure her children knew they were loved and valuable not because of their titles or their address, but because of who they were as people. The palace might have rejected them, but their true worth had never depended on institutional approval. Now they would have the chance to prove that to themselves and to the world, one day at a time, starting with whatever tomorrow would bring in their temporary refuge among the rolling hills of the Cotswolds. The cottage in the Cotswolds appeared through the car's headlights like something from a children's storybook, its honey-colored stone walls and thatched roof creating a picture of rural English charm. After hours of traveling through the darkness, leaving behind the grandeur and formality of palace life, this small dwelling represented both sanctuary and a stark reminder of how dramatically their circumstances had changed. As the car crunched to a halt on the gravel driveway, Camilla gently woke James, whose exhausted sleep had provided temporary escape from the day's trauma. The boy stirred slowly, momentarily confused about where they were before reality reasserted itself, with visible disappointment clouding his features. "Is this where we'll be living now?" he asked, pressing his face against the car window to peer at their new surroundings. "For now, yes," Camilla replied, trying to inject optimism into her voice despite her own uncertainty about their future. "It looks cozy, doesn't it? Much more intimate than the palace." The understatement was almost laughable. After living in rooms with soaring ceilings and windows that overlooked manicured grounds stretching to the horizon, this cottage seemed almost miniature. But there was something appealing about its human scale, its promise of warmth and simplicity after years of navigating the complex protocols and public scrutiny that had defined their palace existence. Sarah emerged from a second vehicle, her efficient nature already evident as she began organizing the logistics of their arrival despite the emotional toll the day had taken on all of them. Her loyalty in accompanying them to this temporary exile touched Camilla deeply, representing the kind of personal connection that had made their palace years meaningful beyond the formal trappings of royal life. "I've arranged for the cottage to be stocked with basic provisions," Sarah explained as they approached the front door, "and the heating has been turned on so it should be comfortable. The owners have been very accommodating about the short notice." The heavy wooden door opened to reveal an interior that was charming in its traditional English cottage style, but impossibly small after their palace quarters. Low-beamed ceilings, narrow hallways, and rooms that could have fit inside their former sitting room created an immediate sense of enclosure that would take considerable adjustment. James explored the cottage with the adaptability of childhood, his natural curiosity overcoming some of his sadness as he discovered the narrow staircase leading to what would be his bedroom under the eaves. The slanted ceiling and small dormer window created a cozy but confining space that bore no resemblance to his grand palace bedroom with its high ceilings and views of the royal gardens. "It's like being in a ship's cabin," he announced, trying to find positive aspects of his new accommodation. "I can touch both walls if I stretch my arms out." His attempt at cheerfulness broke Camilla's heart even as it filled her with pride. Despite his young age, James was already beginning to understand that complaining would only make their situation more difficult for everyone. His resilience reminded her that children often adapted more quickly than adults to changing circumstances, finding wonder in novelty even when that novelty represented loss. The cottage's main room served as both living space and dining area, with a small kitchen tucked into what had once been a pantry. After the formal dining rooms and extensive kitchen facilities of the palace, preparing meals would require a complete reimagining of their domestic routines. Camilla found herself wondering about practical matters that had never concerned her during their royal years: grocery shopping, cooking, cleaning, all tasks that had been handled invisibly by devoted staff. As they settled into their first evening in the cottage, the silence felt oppressive after years of living in a building that hummed with constant activity. No guards patrolling the grounds, no staff preparing for the next day's engagements, no sense of being connected to the larger machinery of national life. They were truly alone for the first time in 3 years, and the isolation was both peaceful and deeply unsettling. Sarah had tactfully arranged to stay in the village inn, recognizing that the family needed time to process their changed circumstances without the additional complexity of maintaining employer-employee relationships in such intimate quarters. Her consideration was typical of the thoughtfulness she had shown throughout their palace years, and Camilla realized how much she would miss having such reliable support. The cottage's small television provided a jarring reminder of their changed status when the evening news briefly mentioned personnel changes within the royal household, without any specifics about their departure. The euphemistic language reduced their family's upheaval to a minor administrative notation, as if 3 years of their lives had been erased with careful diplomatic phrasing. James, curled up in a chair that dwarfed him, looked up from the astronomy book he had carried from the palace. "Will the newspapers write about us leaving?" he asked with the directness that children brought to uncomfortable topics. "Perhaps briefly," Camilla replied honestly. "But these things usually fade from attention quickly. People have many other concerns to occupy their thoughts." The truth was more complex and potentially more hurtful. Their departure would likely generate speculation and gossip, with tabloid journalists eager to uncover the reasons behind their sudden exit from palace life. The privacy they had sacrificed during their royal years would not automatically return just because they were no longer part of the institution. They would need to navigate the transition carefully to avoid becoming a continuing source of public fascination. That night, as James slept in his tiny bedroom under the slanted roof, Camilla lay awake in the cottage's master bedroom, listening to unfamiliar sounds, the wind in the thatch, the settling of old wooden beams, the distant call of an owl. The bed was comfortable but narrow after the spacious royal quarters, and the ceiling seemed to press down upon her like a physical manifestation of their reduced circumstances. Her thoughts turned inevitably to Edward, who remained absent from their crisis as completely as if he had never been part of their family at all. His continued silence felt like a betrayal that went beyond the institutional decisions that had forced their departure. Whatever political or strategic considerations had motivated the royal family's actions, surely basic human decency required some acknowledgement of the personal cost to the children who had looked up to him as a father figure. The next morning brought their first practical challenges as they attempted to establish routines in their cramped quarters. The cottage's small bathroom could barely accommodate one person at a time, requiring careful coordination of morning schedules. The kitchen, while charming with its traditional styling, lacked the space and equipment necessary for preparing anything more elaborate than simple meals. James approached these limitations with characteristic curiosity, treating their reduced circumstances as an interesting puzzle to solve rather than a source of complaint. His adaptability reminded Camilla that children often view dramatic changes as adventures rather than tragedies, finding excitement and novelty even when adults perceived only loss. A knock at the cottage door interrupted their breakfast preparations, bringing the first visitor to their new sanctuary. Camilla opened the door to find a woman in her 60s with kind eyes and flour-dusted hands, carrying a basket covered with a cheerful checked cloth. "I'm Mrs. Davies from the cottage next door," the woman said with the straightforward friendliness typical of rural communities. "I thought you might appreciate some fresh-baked bread and local honey while you're settling in. Moving house is always stressful, especially with children to consider." The simple kindness of the gesture, offered without any knowledge of their background or circumstances, moved Camilla unexpectedly. Here was human warmth extended freely, without calculation or expectation of reciprocal advantage. After years of interactions filtered through protocol and public relations considerations, such genuine neighborliness felt like a revelation. "That's incredibly thoughtful of you," Camilla replied, accepting the basket gratefully. "Would you like to come in for tea?" Mrs. Davies stepped into the cottage's main room with the easy familiarity of someone who had known the property for years. "I've been keeping an eye on this place since the Thompsons moved to Spain," she explained. "It's nice to see it occupied again, especially by a family with a young lad. Gets a bit lonely in the village with so many of the cottages being weekend retreats for city folk." As they shared tea and Mrs. Davies's exceptional bread, Camilla began to glimpse possibilities for a different kind of community connection than they had known during their palace years. The village life that was unfolding around them operated on principles of mutual support and genuine concern rather than the formal obligations and carefully managed relationships that had characterized their royal existence. James, initially shy with this stranger, gradually warmed to Mrs. Davies's gentle questions about his interests and education. When he mentioned his love of astronomy, she immediately invited him to meet her grandson, who shared similar interests and attended the local school. "Young Tom would be delighted to show someone his telescope," she said with obvious pleasure at making the connection. "He's always looking for someone who appreciates the night sky as much as he does. Perhaps you'd both like to come for stargazing next week when the weather clears." The invitation represented exactly the kind of organic social connection that had been impossible during their palace years, when every interaction required security clearance and protocol considerations. Here was the promise of friendships based on shared interests rather than social position, relationships that could develop naturally without the artificial constraints of royal life. After Mrs. Davies departed with promises to return soon with more local intelligence about village life, Camilla found herself viewing their cottage sanctuary with slightly different eyes. The small rooms that had seemed confining began to feel cozy, the intimate scale creating opportunities for closeness that had been more difficult to achieve in the vast spaces of the palace. That afternoon brought a phone call that would significantly impact their immediate future. Emma, calling from her boarding school with characteristic teenage directness, had made a decision that surprised no one who knew her strong-willed nature. "I'm not finishing the term here," she announced without preamble. "I want to come home be with you and James while we figure out what happens next. This is family crisis time, and families should be together. Her determination to abandon her prestigious education in favor of family solidarity touched Camilla deeply while also creating practical complications they hadn't anticipated. Emma's presence would make the cottage even more crowded, but it would also restore their family unit during a time when togetherness seemed more important than convenience. "Are you certain about this, darling?" Camilla asked. "Your education is so important, and leaving midterm could affect your academic standing." "Mother, I can't concentrate on Shakespeare essays when our whole life has been turned upside down," Emma replied with the clarity that often emerged from teenage pragmatism. "Besides, there are good schools in the area where we are. I've already researched it. I can transfer and finish the year locally." Emma's research initiative demonstrated the family trait of facing challenges with practical action rather than passive resignation. Her willingness to sacrifice her prestigious school environment for family cohesion showed a maturity that made Camilla proud, even as it highlighted how much responsibility their circumstances were forcing on young shoulders. The prospect of having both children with her in their cottage sanctuary filled Camilla with relief she hadn't expected to feel. The isolation and uncertainty of their situation would be far more manageable with the family unit intact, facing their challenges together rather than scattered across different environments and support systems. As evening approached, and they prepared for their second night in the cottage, Camilla realized that something fundamental had shifted in her perspective during their first full day away from palace life. The practical challenges of their reduced circumstances were real and sometimes frustrating, but they had also created opportunities for authentic connection that had been harder to achieve within the formal structures of royal existence. James, helping her prepare their simple dinner in the cottage's tiny kitchen, seemed more relaxed than he had been during their final weeks at the palace. The absence of rigid schedules and formal expectations had allowed his natural curiosity and humor to emerge more freely, reminding her of the boy he had been before palace life shaped his daily routines. "I think I like it here," he said unexpectedly as they worked together. "It's different, but not bad different. More like adventure different." His words captured something essential about their situation that Camilla was still learning to appreciate. Their forced departure from palace life had indeed been a form of loss, but it had also created space for discoveries about themselves and their relationships that might never have emerged within the constraints of royal duty and protocol. The cottage might be small and their future uncertain, but for the first time in months, they were living according to their own choices rather than institutional expectations. That freedom, while frightening in its implications, also carried the promise of authenticity that had been increasingly difficult to maintain during their final months as members of the royal family. As they settled into their evening routines in the intimate spaces of their temporary home, Camilla began to wonder if their exile might ultimately prove to be less of an ending than a beginning. The start of a life that belonged entirely to them. 3 months had passed since their arrival at the Cotswolds cottage, and the rhythm of their new life had established itself with surprising naturalness. The stark adjustment from palace grandeur to rural simplicity had given way to a different kind of richness, one measured in genuine relationships and personal growth rather than formal duties and public recognition. Camilla stood in the cottage garden on a crisp spring morning, watching James and Tom Davies work together on a project that would have been impossible during their royal years. The boys were constructing a treehouse in the ancient oak that dominated the small back garden, their collaboration representing the kind of authentic friendship that had been difficult to cultivate within the controlled environment of palace life. Emma had settled into the local comprehensive school with characteristic determination, initially struggling with the dramatic change from her prestigious boarding school environment, but gradually discovering advantages in the more relaxed atmosphere and diverse student body. Her academic abilities had made her popular with teachers struggling with limited resources, and she had found purpose in tutoring younger students in literature and languages. The financial realities of their situation had required significant adjustments that were still being navigated day by day. The modest settlement provided through royal channels would sustain them for several years if managed carefully, but it was a far cry from the unlimited resources they had taken for granted during their palace years. Camilla had discovered an unexpected satisfaction in budgeting and household management, skills she had never needed to develop during her previous life. Sarah had remained with them longer than anyone had expected, though her role had evolved from formal personal assistant to something more resembling a family friend who happened to be exceptionally organized. Her presence during the transition had been invaluable, helping to maintain some stability for the children while they all adapted to their changed circumstances. The village community had embraced them with a warmth that continued to surprise Camilla, who had grown accustomed to the calculated nature of most royal interactions. Mrs. Davies had become a surrogate grandmother to both children, providing the kind of unconditional affection and practical wisdom that had been largely absent from their palace experience. The local shopkeepers treated them as neighbors rather than former celebrities, a normalcy that felt increasingly precious as time passed. One particularly significant development had been Camilla's gradual involvement with the village primary school, which desperately needed volunteers to help with their struggling literacy program. Her background as a librarian, combined with her passion for education, had made her a valuable resource for the overworked teachers trying to help children who lacked adequate support at home. Working with these children, many from families facing economic hardships far more severe than her own current situation, had provided Camilla with perspective on the relative nature of their circumstances. The cottage that had initially seemed confining now felt spacious compared to the cramped council housing where some of her students lived. The financial constraints that required careful budgeting seemed manageable compared to the desperate poverty that prevented some families from providing their children with basic school supplies. The fulfillment she found in this volunteer work reminded her of why she had originally been drawn to educational causes during her royal years. But now her involvement was direct and hands-on rather than ceremonial, allowing her to see immediate results from her efforts. Children who had been struggling with reading were gaining confidence and skills through her patient tutoring, achievements that felt more meaningful than any ribbon-cutting ceremony or formal patronage she had performed as a duchess. Emma had begun joining her mother in this volunteer work, discovering her own passion for teaching and mentoring. The teenager who had initially rebelled against their changed circumstances had found new purpose in helping students navigate academic challenges, her own recent experience with educational disruption making her particularly empathetic to their struggles. "I think I might want to be a teacher," Emma announced one evening as they prepared dinner together in the cottage's tiny kitchen. Not at some posh school where everything is handed to the students on silver platters, but somewhere where I can actually make a difference to kids who really need help. Her words reflected a maturity that had emerged during their months of adjustment, a depth of understanding about social inequality that would have been difficult to develop within the insulated environment of royal privilege. The loss of her prestigious educational opportunities had been painful, but it had also opened her eyes to realities beyond her previous experience. James, meanwhile, had thrown himself into village life with the enthusiasm of a child for whom adventure mattered more than status. His friendship with Tom Davies had introduced him to pursuits that ranged from amateur astronomy to wildlife observation, activities that encouraged his natural curiosity without the formal structure that had characterized his palace education. The local school had welcomed James with open arms, their limited resources meaning that any student who was self-motivated and well-prepared was particularly valued. His advanced education had initially made him stand out, but his genuine friendliness and lack of pretension had quickly earned him acceptance among his new classmates. "I like school here better," James confided to his mother one afternoon after returning from a field trip to a nearby Roman archaeological site. "At the palace, learning felt like something I was supposed to do because it was expected. Here, it feels like something I want to do because it's interesting." His observation captured something essential about their new life that Camilla was still learning to appreciate. The absence of external expectations and formal obligations had created space for authentic interests and relationships to develop organically. They were discovering who they really were beneath the roles they had been assigned during their royal years. The cottage itself had been transformed gradually from a temporary refuge into something approaching a permanent home. Emma's artistic talents had been applied to decorating the small rooms with paintings and crafts that reflected their family's journey, while James had claimed corners for his various collections and experiments. Camilla had created a small study area where she could prepare materials for her tutoring work and pursue her own reading without the constant interruptions that had characterized palace life. The financial constraints that had initially seemed so limiting had forced them to be creative in ways that proved surprisingly satisfying. Instead of purchasing expensive entertainment or dining out frequently, they had discovered simple pleasures, family walks through the countryside, board games by the fire, cooking experiments that sometimes failed spectacularly but always provided laughter and shared experiences. Mrs. Davies had become an invaluable source of practical wisdom about everything from vegetable gardening to home repairs, skills that Camilla was learning with the enthusiasm of someone discovering capabilities she had never known she possessed. The satisfaction of growing their own vegetables or fixing a leaky faucet provided a sense of accomplishment that formal ribbon-cutting ceremonies had never delivered. Spring had brought unexpected visitors to their cottage sanctuary when several former palace staff members made the journey from London to check on their welfare. Mrs. Henderson arrived one Sunday afternoon with tears in her eyes and arms full of care packages, her maternal concern evident in every gesture and question about their well-being. "I've been so worried about you all," she confessed over tea in the cottage's small sitting room. "The palace hasn't been the same since you left. It feels colder somehow, less human." Her words provided comfort, while also highlighting the institutional nature of royal life that Camilla was learning to view with increasing perspective. The warmth and humanity they had brought to palace life had been genuine, but it had also been constrained by the formal structures that governed every aspect of royal existence. The head gardener had also visited, bringing plants from the palace gardens that held special memories for James, along with detailed instructions for their care. His gesture represented the kind of personal connection that transcended employment relationships, the bonds formed through shared experiences and mutual respect. These visits from their former palace community had been emotionally complex, bringing happiness at the reunion while also emphasizing how completely their lives had diverged. The staff members returned to their institutional roles after brief visits, while Camilla and her family continued building their new existence in the countryside. One particularly significant development had been the gradual emergence of contact with Edward, though his communications remained formal and infrequent. His letters arrived through official channels and maintained the careful language of diplomatic correspondence, expressing concern for the children's welfare while avoiding any discussion of the circumstances that had led to their separation. The children's responses to their stepfather's cautious outreach had been mixed. Emma maintained her anger at his failure to support them during their crisis, while James was more willing to accept his explanations about institutional obligations and limited personal agency. Camilla found herself serving as mediator between her children's emotional needs and the complex realities of Edward's position within the royal family. "Why doesn't he just come visit us?" James asked after receiving a formal birthday card that seemed to have been selected by a secretary rather than someone who knew his interests. "It's not that far from London, and we could show him our treehouse and the telescope Tom's grandfather gave us." The innocent questions highlighted the gap between childhood expectations and adult compromises that Camilla was still struggling to bridge. How could she explain to her son that royal duties and protocols might prevent such simple gestures of family connection? How could she help him understand that their former life operated according to rules that prioritized institutional stability over personal relationships? As summer approached, bringing the anniversary of their departure from palace life, Camilla found herself reflecting on the journey they had traveled during their months in the cottage. The grief and anger of their early weeks had given way to acceptance and, increasingly, to gratitude for opportunities they might never have discovered within the constraints of royal existence. The children had grown in ways that would have been impossible within the protected environment of palace life. Emma had developed empathy and purpose through her work with struggling students, while James had discovered interests and friendships that reflected his authentic personality rather than expectations about royal behavior. Camilla herself had rediscovered the satisfaction of meaningful work and genuine community connections that had been difficult to maintain within the formal structures of royal duty. The literacy program that had become her passion was expanding, with plans for a summer reading camp that would serve children from across the region. Their financial situation remained challenging but manageable, requiring careful planning but not the desperate measures that had initially seemed likely. Camilla had begun exploring possibilities for more formal employment that would utilize her skills while allowing her to remain in the community that had become their anchor. The cottage garden was flourishing under their care, providing both practical benefits and emotional satisfaction as they watched their efforts bloom literally and figuratively. James's vegetable patch had become a source of pride, while Emma's flower beds attracted butterflies and birds that enhanced the natural beauty of their small sanctuary. As evening fell on another day in their transformed life, Camilla stood in the cottage doorway watching her children help Mrs. Davies with her evening chores. The sight filled her with contentment that she realized had been absent during many of their palace years, despite all the privileges and opportunities that environment had provided. The fairy tale ending she had once imagined for their family had not materialized, but something more valuable had emerged from the ashes of that dream. They had discovered their authentic selves beneath the roles they had been assigned, found genuine community beyond the artificial constraints of protocol, and built relationships based on mutual affection rather than social obligation. The future remained uncertain in many ways, but it was uncertainty they would face together, armed with the resilience and perspective they had gained through their journey from privilege to simplicity. The cottage might be temporary, but the lessons they had learned and the bonds they had strengthened would sustain them wherever their path might lead. Looking up at the stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky, Camilla felt a peace that had been elusive during their months of transition but now seemed to settle around her like a warm embrace. They had lost a palace, but they had found themselves. In the end, that trait seemed not just acceptable, but miraculous.